Distinguished panelists, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the first NIICE-USI Strategic Dialogue on Navigating the Indo-Pacific. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement and United Service Institution of India have MOU, and we have agreed to have monthly discussion on strategic issues. And for the first NIICE-USI Strategic Dialogue, we have picked an important issue, which is Indo-Pacific. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. Indo-Pacific affairs is one of our important research topics here at NIICE. To chair today's discussion, we have the Director of USI, Major General B.K. Sharma. General B.K. Sharma has always been kind to us. He has always supported, guided, and encouraged us. Let me formally introduce General Sharma, though he needs no introduction to our audience. He is the Director of United Service Institution of India, India's oldest think tank, established by the British in 1870. He was conferred three military award by the President of India for rendering exceptional distinguished national service and for displaying courage. Besides, he has conferred National Award for Nation Building by the Confederation of Education Excellence of India in 2017. He has granted prestigious assignment in India, including command of a mountain division on China border and senior faculty member at the National Defense College. He has represented his country at the UN as a military observer in Central America and has been India's defense attaché in Central Asia. He specializes in strategic needs assessment methodology, scenario building, and strategic gaming. He has visited about 35 countries as member of international delegation and on educational tours. He has participated in 29 international conferences abroad and several such conferences in India. He has edited about 8 books, contributed more than 60 seminar papers at Indian and foreign journals and newspaper, and presented 30 research papers at international conferences. He edits prestigious USI Strategic Yearbook. He has lectured at the prestigious military establishment, policy think tank, and universities, literature festivals in India and abroad. He regularly participates in track 2 level dialogue. We have 4 distinguished and very eminent scholars and experts today. We have John Bradford, who is a senior fellow in the Maritime Security Program at RSIS Singapore. John Bradford is a senior fellow at the Maritime Security Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Immediately prior to coming to RSIS, he was a Council of Foreign Relations, Hitachi International Affairs Fellow placed in Tokyo at the National Graduate Research Institute of Policy Studies. His research focused on Asian security with a special attention given to maritime issues and cooperative affairs. His written work can be found in journals such as Contemporary Southeast Asia, Asia Policy, Asian Security, Asian Survey, Naval War College Review, and Naval Institute Proceedings, as well as in edited volumes, online publications, and monographs published by leading international think tanks. Prior to becoming a full-time researcher, he has spent more than 23 years as an US Navy officer. Second, we have Professor Yoichiro Sato. Professor Yoichiro Sato holds a bachelor's in law from Keio University, master's in international relations from University of South Carolina, and PhD in political science from University of Hawaii. Previously, he has also taught at the US Department of Defense, Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, Auckland University, New Zealand, Kansai Gaidai Hawaii College, and University of Hawaii. Most recently, he was henchback visiting scholar and professor at the Colorado School of Mines. His major work includes Japan in a Dynamic Asia, co-edited with Sato Lee Maya, which was published by Blackson Books in 2006. Norms, Interest, and Power in Japanese Foreign Policy, co-edited with Keiko Hirara, published by Palgrave in 2008. The Rise of China and International Security, co-edited with Kevin Cooney, published by Routledge in 2008. And the US-Japan Security Alliance, Regional Multilateralism, co-edited with Takashi Inoguchi and John Ikenberry, published by Palgrave in 2013. We also have John Blaxland. Professor John Blackson is a professor of international security and intelligence studies and former head of the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at the Australian National University. John is a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy and fellow of the Royal Society of New South Wales, a member of the Asian Army Journal editorial board, and the first Australian recipient of a US Department of Defense Maneuveral Research Institute grant. He holds a PhD in War Studies from Royal Military College of Canada and Master in History from ANU and Bachelor in Honors from UNSW. He's a graduate of the Royal Thai Army Command and Staff College and the Royal Military College. He has extensive experience in the intelligence community, including as the Principal Intelligence Staff Officer of the Australian Infantry Brigade deployed to East Timor in September 1999, as an intelligence exchange officer in Washington, D.C., as Director Joint Intelligence Operation at Headquarters Joint Operation Command, as a principal author of 3 volumes, Official History of the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, and one-time official historian of the Thailand and Myanmar, historian of Australian Signal Directorate. In addition, he was Australian Defense Attaché to Thailand and Myanmar. At ANU, he teaches graduate students, and he has a number of publications such as NIICE War, Australia in Afghanistan and Iraq, 2001 to 2004, in From the Cold, Reflections on Australia's Korean War from 1950 to 1953, a geostrategic SWOT analysis of Australia, tipping the balance in Southeast Asia, Thailand, the United States, and China, the Secret Cold War, the official history of the Australian Security Intelligence Organization from 1975 to 1989, East Timor interventions, the protest years, the Australian Army from Whitland to Howard, strategic and cautions, revisiting counterinsurgency, information era maneuver, signals, swift and sure, organization, and many other publications. We also have Admiral Shekhar Sinha. Admiral Shekhar Sinha is a former Chief of Integrated Defense Staff and was member of Defense Acquisition Council between 2010 to 2012. During his tenure, the long-term integrated prospective plan was compiled and approved by the government. He's a naval aviator of fighter stream and has flown over 2,700 hours. He is trained aviation acquisition and as an assistant chief of naval staff. Later, he held command of the potent Western Fleet. He retired in 2014 as a commander-in-chief of the Western Naval Command, based in Mumbai, with the additional responsibility of commander-in-chief, coastal security, Western Seaboard. I'd like to request Director USI, Major General B.K. Sharma, to moderate the session, and he may briefly introduce USI as well. The program is also streaming live on our Facebook. The participants can drop their questions under Facebook Live or on Zoom chat. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal, for this initiative and partnering with USI and getting us an excellent panel which represent the Quad countries. In fact, it is really a very important session today because there are so many developments which are taking place in the Indo-Pacific, and it is in that strategic backdrop we need to have a very informed discussion. You have already briefed about the USI, but suffices to say that we are India's oldest think tank, 150 years old, and we have a partnership with a large number of foreign think tanks. And we, among other things, we specialize in strategic scenario building, gaming, which we conduct for our policy makers. So very warm welcome to eminent panelists, our council members, other participants. Now, what I intend doing that I want to give maximum time to our esteemed speakers, as also for the question answer session. And after my brief contextual remarks, I will request each speaker, starting with Mr. Bradford, then request Professor Sato, then Professor Blaxland, and then finally Admiral Sinha to give their initial assessment about the geopolitical developments that are taking place in the Indo-Pacific and how things are likely to pan out. After that, I would make some interventions, and if there are certain areas which require elucidation and further explanation, I'll raise those issues. And towards in the second round, what we intend doing is we would look at how do we sort of put together a strategic, robust strategic response so that there is enduring peace and prosperity in the region. Now, let me begin with what is already very well known to most of the participants in this discussion, that we know that Indo-Pacific is a geographic construct which is marked by the coupling of the two seas, that is Indian Ocean and Pacific, and it is linked through very critical choke points of Malacca, Sundal, Lombok, and Makassar. This is a geostrategic sort of a factor which we need to bear in mind. Now, these two oceans are actually, they are linked by maritime trade and security, and this is not from recent times, but it has its historical basis. And the strategic importance of the region lies in the fact that it represents half the world population, seven of the six of the 10th largest economies, one third of world exports, half the maritime tonnage, and there are about 8 of the 10th largest armies and 5 nuclear powers resident in this region. It is also the main supplier of oil imports to East Asian countries, and therefore the eastern slogs and the western slogs that pass through these regions, which are the lifelines for the economy of many countries. Also, it represents a very rich panoply of civilizations, whether you gauge from demography, geography, economy, military, or any other metric. But on the flip side, today's geopolitics there is mired in strategic brinkmanship, and that is in a VUCA environment that is characterized by volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, which is further accentuated by COVID-19 strategic shock. We know there are a large number of flashpoints there, and the region is witnessing what we call is some kind of a new Cold War, vicious gray zone conflict. There is a nuclear saber rattling by some of the countries, and contestants have resorted to aggressive military posturing and are undertaking dangerous military maneuvers. Added to this are a host of non-traditional security threats. Particularly, we have seen the pandemic very recently, and there are larger looming threats of climate change and global terrorism and cyber security. Now, what is ironical here is that the historical animosities, heightened cartographic consciousness, deepening strategic mistrust, and absence of viable CBMs and conflict prevention and resolution measures increase the risk of a military confrontation. Presently, some geopolitical developments that are taking place, that we know that Pax Americana during the Trump administration has lost its sheen. And because of the belligerent behavior of China, even Pax Seneca has lost its appeal. And we are witnessing some kind of an asymmetric bipolarity, and some call it as a diffused multipolarity in the region. Now, this strategic brinkmanship is manifest with an intent to reorder the balance of power in the region. And in this, we know that the main contestants are US and China, and there is alignment and realignment of their positions by the middle level power and hedging, balancing and binding by smaller powers like ASEAN to safeguard their security and economic interests, which are intertwined with US and China respectively. Now, US seeks to retain its resident hegemonic status here, and it has therefore come out with the US Indo-Pacific vision, which somewhat converges with similar visions recently enunciated by India, Japan, France, Germany, even ASEAN's Indo-Pacific outlook, even though there lie intrinsic convergences and divergences within that. Now, China seeks to create a Sino-centric Indo-Pacific through strategic initiatives such as BRI, regional comprehensive economic cooperation, much against the liking of US. It has gone ahead with the Eurasia or European Union Sino investment agreement, and also it has a very viable and sound financial institutions like Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. From the perspective of security, it looks at the region in terms of two ocean strategy, and the operating part of that is anti-access, anti-denial. It has created air defense identification zone. It is militarizing the islands in the South China Sea. It resorts to military coercion, military belligerence, and very recently you are witnessing the wolf warrior diplomacy to further, serve its narrowly defined core interests. On the other hand, US under Biden administration is attempting to revamp its Euro-Atlantic alliance, strengthen NATO, energize East Asia security alliance system, institutionalize Quad with a proposal to expand it further and upgrade it to a summit level kind of a event. There are parallel initiatives such as the new G11, Democracy 10, that is D10, and even now Joe Biden is proposing the summit of democracies. US has also countered China by resorting to forward posturing. It has its own version of air-sea battle in which it looks at Guam and Diego Garcia as to two hubs, and its aircraft carrier groups and its amphibious ready forces at some kind of sword arms to moderate China's behaviors. There are also talks about decoupling and diversification of supply chains which are dominated by China. Now, it is in the midst of this we need to navigate this strategic milieu in the Indo-Pacific region. So with that as a background, I would request the speakers to just enlighten us what is their assessment, how things are likely to pan out. And may I now request Mr. Bradford to give his perspective in about 6 to 7 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you very much, sir. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out today, to NIICE and to USI for inviting me, and to all of you to take the time to hear us. I'm very much looking forward to learning from the other three panelists, as well as from your questions, and hopefully not just questions, but some discussions. So I was asked to talk from a US perspective. And so even though I live in Singapore and I've been outside the US, I haven't been living in the US for almost a decade, I thought I would start off there with my perspective on what the Biden administration is likely to do. And then, as was already been previewed, I think one of the Biden administration's most important activities in the Indo-Pacific will be how it pushes ahead with the Quad concept. So I'd like to discuss what I think is likely to happen there and what will be most useful. So first of all, I don't think that, careful watchers, there's been any big surprises with the Biden administration. It's already been noted that Pax Americana lost some of its sheen during the Trump years. But I would point out that when I talk to people across East and Southeast Asia, there's very much a divided view on that sheen. On one hand, there are people who see Trump as unreliable. They are confused by his rhetoric. Or they are, or places like South Korea are worried about his commitment to a steady alliance, and the transactional nature causes some troubles. On the other hand, the stronger position against China was very much welcomed for some. And I'd say more often than not, people will tell me that the alliances, despite surface tensions, are stronger than ever. I would say that the Biden administration then comes into the stance with a great opportunity. The position of Washington against, towards decoupling and seeing and regarding China as a strategic rival, that is cemented and it is bipartisan. There's very few people that don't see the world that way in Washington right now. So that gives Biden the opportunity to continue the strong stance that was so popular among some of his partners or some of the American partners, while at the same time revitalizing alliances at all levels. And so I think in there you're going to see less picking of issues that are relatively minor to the United States, such as exactly how many billions of dollars should go into host nation support or other small issues in favor of advancing alliances and figuring out just exactly how we're going to work together. I also think that it's worth noting that the Indo-Pacific concept is alive and well. Although this concept in one form or another has been with us for areas. One, as much as the Biden administration has taken the steps, such as appointing Kurt Campbell as an Asia czar, placing the Indo-Pacific at the center of its policies, as much as it wants to make that policy a reality, it will be distracted by other regions. We're already seeing distractions from Iran. We will see distractions from Europe, especially as Russia continues to bow down on NATO and the EU and NATO continue to fracture in some ways. There will be issues from the southern part of the United States, whether it be immigration or instability, et cetera, that are going to distract the United States. So as much as it's committed to the Indo-Pacific, it's partially, as already been noted, committed to the Indo-Pacific because it wants to remain in its hegemonic position, but that's a global hegemonic position. And then the second place where I think that you may find the Biden administration stumbling a bit is on the human rights issues. One of the advantages of the Trump administration's transactional approaches to partners was it had no trouble restarting relationships with Cambodia that had been restrained under the Obama administration. It didn't have to worry so much about the path to democracy in Thailand when it decided to bring its partnership to Thailand back together. And as we see with the tragic events which are unfolding in Myanmar, human rights and democracy will be issues. And with the Biden administration calling for a summit of democracies and placing progressive ideals into its agenda is going to have to balance that out if it wants to have staying power in the Pacific. So while overall, I think that the United States, as they say in Washington, is back and in many ways never left. I think that is true. And I think that will strengthen deterrence and will create more opportunities for balancing against a rising China and to protect the interests of smaller states. But at the same time, it's not all rosy. There will be issues. And I won't go too much into the details of the Quad, but I'll just say that it is most useful as an operating framework for the Indo-Pacific. I don't think it should become an alliance. I think the discussion of it becoming an Asian NATO is a distraction. And I think that the many people in this room would understand why the relationships are just not strong enough to be there. And if you're not strong enough to be an alliance, don't call yourself alliance, because then a country which is worried about being contained will find seams in that alliance. And a broken alliance is worse than no alliance at all. Better to be a cooperative framework. And while the senior political leaders will figure out just how close the countries can get and just how close our strategies can be aligned and our interests are aligned, I would argue that there's a lot of work that can be done right now to build that cooperation in the region, especially in the areas where trade and information flows. That's maritime, space, cyber, and finance. I think the countries can get together right now to continue working on things like military access and military logistics, continuing info sharing, and build those bedrocks of cooperation so that if something more substantial comes along, you have foundations to build on. And I'll leave it at there. That's my 7 minutes. And I really would rather hear Sato Sensei speak.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I think from Japan's perspective, although the Prime Minister Abe, brought up this concept early on, and then in his discussion with then President-elect Donald Trump, led to the U.S. Adoption of this terminology of free and open Indo-Pacific. There has been some gap and I think many of you probably in the way Japan uses this term. Initially, it was supposed to be a strategy, but then the word strategy was replaced with vision. And this shows that Japan was somewhat cautious of being viewed as adopting the same kind of containment strategy, very strongly led by the US Department of Defense initially, but then later, as the State Department recovered from the initial turmoil under the Trump administration, under the new Secretary of Mike Pompeo, the Pompeo adopted a very anti-Chinese formulation of Indo-Pacific. And it was evidently clear that Japan was trying to keep distance from the way Pompeo was defining this particular terminology about the Indo-Pacific. I'll come back to that point a little bit later, but let me go back briefly to Japan's role in the Indian Ocean region. The Indian Ocean region has always been very important for Japan for obvious reason of the transporting energy resources back to Japan. And for that purpose, Japan's Middle East diplomacy oftentimes required a very fine-tuned approach to balance between the alliance with the United States and Japan's own diplomatic relations in the Middle East. From the 1990s to 2012, for a little over 2 decades period, we have witnessed the growing Japanese security activities in the Indian Ocean region. And it started with Japan's counterterrorism activity, but also you can even go back to the Gulf War time when Japan, after the conflict ended, Japan sent minesweepers to the Persian Gulf. So gradually Japan built on its activities in the Indian Ocean region, but it was more defined in terms of burden sharing with the United States and alliance management. Another word, meeting the American request to keep the Americans think that Japan is becoming a useful ally. That aspect was very strong. And on top of that, Japan avoided defining those contributions in the bilateral term. Japan always wanted to use one way or another the United Nations framework and mandates. So when that wasn't very possible, Japan would rather define it as a unilateral activity. Although in effect, all of those Japanese naval activities were very closely coordinated with the United States. But in terms of legal terminology, Japan could not define it in collective defense and bilateral terms. The Abe period did two things. First, Abe in 2014 to 2015 changed the constitutional interpretation and passed a new national security legislation, which enabled collective defense with the United States and also possibly other countries, primarily with Australia in mind. And this shift to collective defense was primarily for the purpose of enhancing the joint roles between the self-defense forces and the US military for the defense of Japanese territory and the adjacent areas. The law doesn't geographically bind itself, but the objective is pretty clear. Japan's primary concerns are in its neighborhood, and Japan was not thinking of immediately applying this law to joint working with US forces in the remote areas. So that was what Japan did earlier. And as the US relative position is declining, Japan is increasingly thinking that the task of assisting the United States in remote areas, especially in the Indian Ocean region, needs to be done by somebody, but Japan itself is still not very capable or willing to do that. Japan faces a severe resource limitation, and for that, it was necessary that Japan works very hard at networking the existing alliances and also lining up new alignment partners, including India. So that's how Japan views this Indo-Pacific region. And finally, let me just say a few words about the economic aspect and decoupling. China is Japan's #1 trade partner, and the Australians and the Indians also feel the same way. So the language there, Japan and India both prefers the term the prosperous in the Indo-Pacific formulation. And decoupling is problematic for Japan, especially the way the Trump administration pursued this issue, because many of Japanese electronics components, for example, find their ways into production in China and eventual export into the United States. So indirectly, Japanese firms are being hurt, and the selective decoupling, such as high-tech products, such as semiconductor chips, is likely to happen, and the alignment between Japan, US, and Taiwan will probably proceed, but that will really leave South Korea in a very, very awkward situation. So I think both Biden administration and Suga administration need to closely coordinate their decoupling strategy, as the bulk of the Japanese companies are already saying that they're not moving out of China. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I now request Professor Blaxland to give us his perspective, particularly from the Australian vantage point. Over to you, Professor.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for the warm invitation. I want to share my screen because I'm going to run through a few slides quickly. So please bear with me as I do that. Essentially, what I want to do is give you a bit of a sense of the evolving geopolitical scenario and its impact on peace and stability from an Australian perspective. And this map gives you a sense of Australia hanging off Southeast Asia, but also of how the concept of the Indo-Pacific makes an enormous amount of sense from Australia's point of view. But in the corner there, you see there, from the way I see it, there's three crucial areas of challenge, and that is great power contestation, looming environmental catastrophe, and a spectrum of governance-related challenges that are leading to breakdown in law and order in many parts of the neighbourhood of Australia. So let me just go through some of these things for you. I'll come across here, pardon me. So this is what I'm saying is response to what I did recently, a geostrategic SWOT analysis for Australia. Of course, a SWOT is a business concept where you look at the internal strengths and weaknesses and external opportunities and threats. And that's downloadable from the web, if you like. But essentially, I'll go quickly through it to give you a sense of where we stand, what the strengths and weaknesses are, and the opportunities and threats. Now, we've got a number of strengths: natural resources, a strong economy, domestic political stability, and the rule of law, an educated workforce, but dependent until this year anyway, on foreign students heavily. We've got a multicultural society. And that's benefited from migration from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. Australia only 54 years ago got rid of the White Australia policy, and we're a richer country for now, increasingly so. We've got a honed and high-tech defence force that's boutique. It's essentially, it can't sustain attrition in substantial conflict. It's a one-punch force. It's got an army of one to two divisions, depending on how you count it, a navy of 12 warships and a handful of submarines, and an air force of basically 105. So it's not very much. But that's partly because we're an island continent. We have no shared land borders. We have no real disputes with anybody. So people can look and say, well, of course you don't need a big defence force. And part of that, you can see there in the bottom right there, its Pacific territories and its engagement in Japan and Korea. This book, Australia's American Alliance, outlines in detail the breadth and depth of some of the ties between Australia and the United States that are really the bedrock of Australia's security. And of course, the satellite photo in the top there of Pine Gap, what my late great colleague Des Ball called the suitable piece of real estate, or the strategic essence of the ties with the United States. So they're the strengths. Looking at the weaknesses, there's been a complacency about security and our place in the world. We've had revolving doors prime ministers over the last decade, and it doesn't seem to have mattered. Our economy's prospered. We've all been okay. And there's been a kind of a she'll be right, mate approach. But I would argue that that is no longer tenable. We have infrastructure pressures and uneven population distribution across Southeast Australia, despite having only 26 million people in the country. And we've got a dependency on international service providers. We've seen one of our last oil refineries closed in Melbourne. So we're reliant on oil from Singapore and South Korea. And what could possibly go wrong there? I can list a dozen or so things that could go wrong there, of course. And there are other vulnerabilities with GPS and communications cables as well. We've got power vulnerabilities. We happily export uranium. We won't take it back and we don't use it, despite being the rated continent on the planet. That one has got me bamboozled. We have plenty of solar, and yet we're not solar champions. And we're dealing with hydro, but not as well as we could. Then we've got cyber vulnerabilities. Now we've gone from being web enabled to web dependent, and then web vulnerable. And we're seeing cyber attacks. My own university, the Australian National University, has been subject to a whole range of attacks lately. And then we've got limited sovereign capacity to respond to extended multifaceted crises or war. And we're trying to pick up on that space, but it's really a bit slow and a bit late. Then we've got some opportunities, and I'll do this geographically. South Pacific is enormous. This map here on the right is one of my favorites, showing the exclusive economic zones of the South Pacific. And you can see why China wants to get its hands on it. This is enormously, potentially lucrative. This is a space where the micro-states have enormous exclusive economic zones, enormous potential there, and the great powers want to play in that space enormously. Australia does too. In ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, this we have tended to conceptually disaggregate in our consciousness, and yet when you group it, it's a proto-great power. It's consequential economically, about half as great economically as India, and up there in the grand scheme of things. For Australia, it matters enormously, and we need to pay it more attention. Northeast Asia, the connections with Korea, Japan, the People's Republic of China and Taiwan are well known, and I don't need to dwell on them, except of course the fact that we've seen growing concern about China's illiberal assertiveness, which we can talk about. Ties with the Indian Ocean, particularly with India and across the Indian Ocean Rim Association, have been growing, manifested in part through the Quad, but other means as well. Then we've seen remarkable interest from shown an interest in this part of the world, and I'm happy to entertain questions about that later. Of course, the United States remains Australia's principal ally, and there is something to be said for the so-called demonstration effect, whereby Australian policy and actions have a demonstration effect on the neighbours. But of course, as this graph shows, showing a study I did recently with a colleague in Thailand, the red line being perceptions of influence of China and the blue line being perceptions of influence of the United States. American influence hasn't gone away, but it's been eclipsed, and that's deeply worrying. One area we don't give much attention to is Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, but Australia has an ambit claim for 40% of the Antarctic territory, and that is under challenge from China and elsewhere, but particularly from China. And if in the future, that place melts and becomes green, this is going to be increasingly contested. Then threats, foreign interference, cyber attack, America's evident transactional retreat from ideational leadership, which everybody's hoping Joe Biden will be able to follow through on reversing, but everyone's a bit wary about his ability to do that. Religiously and politically motivated violence, domestically and abroad, in Southeast Asia especially. Then the risk of conventional and or nuclear war. My colleague Brendan Taylor wrote the Four Flashpoints, talking about East China Sea, South China Sea, Taiwan, and Korea. That's in addition to the challenges on the line of actual control in the Himalayas. Then, of course, there's increased environmental challenges and transnational security concerns with violent jihadist extremists, digital network organized crime, violent political action thriving, slavery, human trafficking, piracy, and so on. And then there's risks of large-scale unregulated people movement. We have nearly a million refugees in Bangladesh who've been kicked out of Myanmar, and there's real concern about them possibly getting on boats and disturbing the order, the governance order of maritime Southeast Asia and Australia as well. But of course, that could become a lot worse if environmental challenges are to be believed and if the threats of the future grow commensurately. For us, the risk of a breakdown in relations with Indonesia is of grave risk. And of course, we've been playing a game of snakes and ladders in our relationship with Indonesia. We kind of work our way incrementally up the ladder, and then we're down the snake, we come over beef, boat, spies, Clemency Timor, Papua Jerusalem. We keep poking them in the eye, unfortunately. And then there are some existential, significant challenges for the Southwest Pacific, which is the converse of the opportunities, the challenge about great power interest in exclusive economic zones, the fisheries, the seabed mining, the environmental challenges and the governance challenges with narco-terrorism, people smuggling, drug smuggling, etc. Yeah. So the final one is diminished biodiversity. And of course, we're living with the consequence of that now with the pandemic. I wrote this just before the pandemic, not quite appreciating what we are heading into. So there we have the SWOT, ladies and gentlemen. So there's a spectrum of security challenges we're facing. And they, as I say, my distillation of them is in these three areas: great power contestation, environmental challenge, and governance challenges. So what should be the Australian response of Australia for the peace and security in the region? That, ladies and gentlemen, we will have to wait until afterwards, because that's coming up later on. There we go. And I hope that's not too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this exhaustive presentation. And now, before I turn to Admiral Sinha, after, sir, you make your initial remarks, I will raise a set of questions, and then you could be the first one to respond to those questions. And I think you have a commitment. So you may kindly depart, and then we'll interact with the rest of the panelists to find certain answers to those questions. Over to Admiral Sinha for your initial remarks.
Well, thank you, Director Yoichiro and NIICE for inviting me to this very important matter of discussion, along with very distinguished panelists who have said all that was required to be said. All I will add is that, when you say navigating through Indo-Pacific, like a typical nautical man, this navigation is not going to be a very easy passage because it is full of hazards. Some are created, some are natural, and some are fallout of the first two that I mentioned. What we are seeing now is obviously a great power competition in our Indo-Pacific region. But I look at Indo-Pacific in very three distinct sections. If you look at the map, the Indian Ocean region, the South China Sea, and the East Sea, followed by the Western Pacific. And like-minded countries, when you say that they are cooperating, they have, you have a Indo-Pacific strategy, or you have a system like Quad, backed by Malabar exercise, I would think that each of these sections have got a regional sort of leader as far as economy and military power is concerned, and US has to be omnipresent in all these three sections. For example, Indian Ocean, backed by US, the Indian leadership, both economic and military, is strong enough. Similarly, when you go to the South China Sea or East Sea, Japan, US, possibly Indonesia, still coming up. These three countries will have a lot to do to prevent the the lawlessness approach of China in that region. And in the Western Pacific, Australia and the US. So if I see this as three regions, and there are three very much so-called headmasters in each region for ensuring the maritime security. But security alone is not good enough. In a big power competition, the middle powers will get impacted. Their prosperity, their economy, everything is going to get impacted, and therefore, I personally very seriously see that there is a space for middle power to steer clear of this, the hegemony of either of China or of US, and get entangled in any friction or a war kind of scenario, which can have a very devastating impact on these middle power countries. So I have been proposing that middle power should come together. US is present, omnipresent, because the manner in I see the present President Biden's administration, of course, they have repeated all the good things which Trump administration had. But how far will they go? Will they go, or will they maintain the same tempo as of President Trump, or will it sort of come down in its intensity? My guess is that it will come down in intensity, because it's already a little bit of reconciliatory approach I can see with the US. And I'm glad Sato-san mentioned that Japan is also, shall I say, not very reluctant, but Japan has a lot at stake. But so has India, so has Australia. China is the largest trading partner of more than 120 countries, including these four. So those compulsions will always remain. And decoupling is something which is, full decoupling is not a possibility in a short term or even in a medium term. Because while we are trying to decouple, China has not stopped increasing its technical sort of advancement, 5G, AI, so many things. And therefore, I think that it is time for unity if we have to resist or restrict. So once General Sharma takes over from here, I have a few sort of suggestions and recommendations as to how do we go about it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I think we had a very good initial response from the experts. My big question here is that the big elephant in the room is China and its Belt and Road Initiative, which has a very heavy and strong economic component in it, which is creating some kind of a gravitational pull to other countries that need development. Now, so far, whatever initial contours we see, it has a very strong tone of security alliance. And the other aspects of geopolitical alignments, security, technology, those are actually not very well defined. And unless we are able to put some money collectively and meet those developmental needs and economically balance China, how are we going to proceed further? So this is my major issue, because I feel the future of Quad, unless there is a strong technological and economic component in it, appears to me absolutely dim. So therefore, my questions that I have is to say, Dr. Bradford, what has happened to, say, US policy of Asia Reassurance Act, its Build Act? Is it going to be converted and subsumed by the Swot, a very comprehensive policy? Likewise, if you look at, say, Japan. Now, Japan has come out with what they call is Expanded Partnership for Quality Infrastructure Initiative, wherein you want to pump in some money in the region. But so far, we have not seen any except on bilateral basis, but you've not gone into a multilateral kind of a construct. Can that be part of your, what you call is Quad? Coupled with this is, is Japan keen to be the sixth eye? You already got a 5-eye kind of a dispensation. And there is a talk of Japan joining the as a sixth eye. I also listened to the Foreign Minister of Australia, and from the presentation of the professor, it appears that Australia, on one hand, you are asserting for the centrality of ASEAN, and you do not want to get sandwiched between the two hegemons, that is United States of America and other. So I feel there is some kind of a hedging which is already inbuilt in a country like Australia. Now come to India. India is the only country which has 3,488 kilometer contested borders. And for the last 8 months, we were virtually short of war with China. And therefore, there is a risk of, India becoming the fall guy and in that kind of a thing, that if other countries are hedging, then India has a real problem. So I would request General Sinha that Admiral Sinha, how does this border issue will come into the India's calculus of how much should they push the envelope and how much they should get part of this, particularly in the security domain. Same is the dilemma of Japan having the dispute with Senkaku Island, and China has already got an air defense identification zone there. And they take some very, very assertive, belligerent maneuvers, particularly using these coast guards there. So keeping these geopolitical realities in mind, what is the prognosis of Quad or any other dispensation in the Indo-Pacific? What is the attraction for its getting expanded with countries like Germany, UK, France, Singapore, South Korea joining the bandwagon? Or is it that we are looking towards a world where maybe in times to come, keeping in view the interdependence and complementarity in the economic relationship of China and US, they find a new modus vivendi and find some kind of a notional balance of power in the region, because such concepts have been doing circles in the past, what you call as Great Two. So with this kind of a thing, may I now request Admiral Sinha to give his views on the subject.
Thank you, General BK. I think you have really hit the nail on the head, because unless the present is sort of brought under control, it will be very difficult to have a hold on the future. The second big issue that you talked about, the technology and other developmental agenda, you're absolutely right. If you take the case of India, we are just about 3 trillion economy, and China is about 12 point something. I believe it is likely to hit 15. So you're talking about fending against a country which has got 5 times your economy and maybe 3-4 times your military. May not be qualitatively as good, but the point is that we have to come together. Now that is the first one that I recommend, that 2-3 countries have to come together. 4 countries have come together, and they have to concentrate on few basic things. When it comes to collaboration, the capacities of all these countries have to be developed, brought up to some reasonable standard, and also of the countries, as you mentioned, Quad Plus. Maybe France, maybe Indonesia, maybe Philippines, maybe Taiwan, if push comes to shove. All these countries must be capable enough to jointly fend off the aggressive rise or painful rise of China, as I mentioned. That's the word I use for that. Also, a 5G technology, AI technology in the hands of authoritarian regime is a disaster. Because I have always personally felt that all niche technologies should be with a democratic country if you want to save the world from disasters of a niche technology. You see the Second World War, you see the First World War, it is so. So I would think that we should have a short-term and long-term goals against China. Firstly, as far as the short-term is concerned, we should prevent China to threaten the interests of like-minded countries. That's only the interest, possibly the economic interest, possibly the diplomatic interest, governance interest, and security. And lastly, very important is public health. Ultimately, one also says that the bioweapons have been used by the Chinese when it came to the Wuhan virus. How far it is true, we don't know, but certainly started from there. And tomorrow, if there is a war and China quietly lets these viruses off in the border areas, they will surely walk in without fighting a war. So this is one possibility that I see. Second thing is that you should be able to prevent, deter, defend, and impose cost to China when it violates any rule. Now that is easier said than done. It's not very going to be so easy to do it. So I would think that first thing to strengthen right now amongst the Quad countries is the recovery from the pandemic is number one, because we are all struggling with this, virus to go away, and that has taken best part of our economy out of the system in last about 1 year, and it's going to take a very long time to recover from this. Second important issue will be innovation and energy technologies, alternate energy technologies, boost the research and development, just like you have a STEM sort of stream, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. These 4 have to be strengthened in these countries who are wanting to defend China. You should start working from now. Education, infrastructure you mentioned, absolutely right. You put some money in infrastructure and show it. Because what has happened, just give you an example of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has cancelled the East Container Terminal contract, or rather the agreement, which India and Japan were supposed to build together because of the economic coercion of China. Possibly they have been promised much more what we could do. So that is one very big issue that we have to be handling this. New military capabilities, yes. Once science and technology cooperation comes, you will have this new military technology. As far as defending is concerned, we will have to restrict the Chinese engagement in the economic sector and as well as in the national security sector. Like imposing a ban on the apps, which India has done. It has caused a lot of hardship to a lot of companies in China. It's nearly, I believe that it has cost them $6 billion in terms of losing jobs and losing money. Second one is that resist the Chinese economic coercion by sort of reducing economic dependence of China on these countries. How you do it is again a challenge, but in the short term, I sense that this is a possibility to do this. And lastly, you have to not only engage with friends, but also engage with China from a position where you are slightly stronger than the Chinese are. For example, you mentioned about the at sea. Right now, India is in a position of strength. In the South China Sea, probably the balance of power is, hanging absolutely really in balance. And Pacific, it is very much with the Australians and the US Navy. So I think that these are the areas in which we can engage with each other so that the potential of war or a friction does not sort of spill over into something big. China also has some mutual interest, which will match with all these four countries, the Quad and maybe more. The one that I see is public health, immediate one. Second one is the climate change. Thirdly will be the global economy. Then it will be non-proliferation. These are the areas where I think that Chinese we must engage with China, and they will be quite happy to, meet at some middle point and do something which is good for the world. And my sense is that when time comes, as a slow process, because this is a slow method of progress, that there will be change in the manner in which China looks at the world and in the manner the rest of the world looks at the world. So I will stop here. There are long-term strategies also, but short-term, this is what my suggestion is.
Thank you, sir, for that very thought-provoking response. And with that, may I now request Professor Sato to give his response based on what issues I had raised and some of the issues which Admiral Sinha has flagged. Over to you, Professor Sato.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, there were many points that I need to respond, I think. The one issue about the infrastructure aid, Japan has been involved in bilateral aid, and will Japan try to frame it in a multilateral way through the Quad channel? Well, I think India and Japan have discussed jointly approaching the Africa connectivity, and it's still conceptual base, but there might be some tangible resource coming toward that initiative. And I think Australia, US, and Japan are also talking about assisting Pacific Island countries. And if it's not multilateralized, I think it will be coordinated, still bilaterally distributed. So that kind of coordination might be sufficient rather than creating a multilateral body. And I think Japan could still use ADB as long as other countries help Japan balance China's presence within that organization. Five Eyes, I think Japan is very willing to join, and I think it's a matter of how well Japan can improve its domestic law to keep secret. And the leftist opposition against the national secrecy law is quite strong, and I don't know if Abe can not Abe, sorry, the Suga or any of his successor can effectively make an improvement on it. The Senkaku Island, I think, is definitely a hot issue right now, and China's recent the announcement of the new Coast Guard law, which basically enables the Chinese patrol boats to fire upon the Japanese patrol boats or Southeast Asian patrol boats and so forth, is quite worrisome. And because China has been sending patrol boats into the territorial water of the Senkaku Islands and chasing the Japanese fishing boats, this has become a real fear that China may be ready to use a kind of gray zone tactic to can change the status quo of Japan's administrative control. And there was issue about contribute to the Quad, and I think there are many things India can do, and I think India's naval build-up in the Indian Ocean region is very much hoped by Japan, and India and Japan through exercises or jointly offering training to a third party in the region. Those are very much in the way. And I think the arms transfers already happening, and Japan's transfer of Japanese arms to India, or India's transfer of arms to South China Sea littoral countries like the Brahmo missile to the Philippines and so forth. I think that sort of networking is very helpful, because many of the developing countries in the region cannot afford American weapons. And if India can join the suppliers, that will offer more choices for them. And there was something about Asian NATO in the question, I think. I really doubt that Asian NATO is in any kind of near future. The division within the ASEAN group is still quite substantial, and grouping them all together in a coherent alliance is just a wishful thinking. Finally, there's one point about the recent the Japanese expressions in the Quad meetings. The last one, not the most recent one, in the last one, when the Secretary of State Pompeo was very openly criticizing China, it was Japan which refrained from naming China. But the most recent online Quad Foreign Minister meeting, Japan was actively naming China. And the question was whether that reflect a change in Japanese policy. I don't think so. I think Japan's policy has been consistent, but I think it tries to balance the U.S. rhetoric. And in the most recent meeting, the Biden was the one who kind of refrained from naming China in the official statement. So. Not the Biden, sorry, the U.S. Secretary of State. So instead, Japan was naming China, and the timing was also very important. That the China passed this the new Coast Guard law just before the Quad foreign ministers meeting. So. Japan had to express quite a strong statement at this occasion. And I think it kind of pushes the Biden administration to not to be too soft on China. Such a fear, I think it's not accurate, but such a fear does exist in Tokyo.
I just got a follow-up question, Professor Sato, 2 follow-up questions. What you find is the feasibility of a construct wherein Japan takes care of East China Sea, India takes care of the Indian Ocean region, Australia takes care of the choke points along the Indonesian archipelago, and that gives space for maneuver to America, probably in the Western Pacific. Given your geographical proximity and a very heavy military posturing opposite you by China, are you comfortable with this kind of a construct? This is my question 1. And my question 2 is, what is that low-hanging fruit for Quad that we should immediately grab? Yeah.
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. The first one, the geographic division of labor among the Quad countries. I don't think that the mutual trust has grown to such a degree to kind of divide the tasks like that. Most likely, I think Japan would prefer to see everybody to be in the Indian Ocean. Some Japanese presence, some US presence, enhanced Indian presence, and if Australians want to be there by solving their debate between the West and the East, then Australians should be welcome to be there as well. And of course, I think we shouldn't forget the European roles in the Indian Ocean region. I think they will be an important part of the Japan, Korean Peninsula region and take part in some of the UN sanction operation against. So the broad coalition will include many of those parties. The joint capacity building, and I think JICA project to train the Coast Guard officers, and Japan is bringing in, this year only online, but Japan has been bringing in Coast Guard officers from not only the East African coast, but even from the West African coast. And it's kind of indicative that the Europeans are not doing enough in those, so that the Japan is filling the void all the way to the West Africa. And I think all of the Quad nations can put their efforts together to train more of those African Coast Guard officers, so that we don't have to worry about pirates and transnational crimes there. So I think that would be my low-hanging fruits.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a very, very, I think, a deft response to this. Now, I'll just address Professor Blaxland. Kindly tell us from the Australian perspective, what are your dilemmas, what are the evaluation of choices, and what would be your strategic response to the ensuing geopolitical scenario in the Indo-Pacific? Over to you, Professor.
Yeah, thanks very much, General BK. A couple of points, if I can start. Firstly, on the Quad, it's very important to not confuse it with NATO. There are no mutual defence clauses to the Quad arrangement. But let's not worry about it not being NATO. I think it's still very useful for increasing familiarization, increasing interoperability, increasing levels of mutual understanding and trust and familiarity to actually have a deterrent effect. And part of the deterrent effect is actually complicating any potential response to the Quad from the People's Republic of China by being a little bit ambiguous. And I think that that's a very healthy thing. So I'm not at all concerned about that. But I do take on your point earlier on about the future of Quad. Unless there's a strong technological and economic component, it's not going to get us very far. I think your point is a very valid one, but I think this is something that we need to see more fundamentally about the place of economics. Power, national power, is the foundation of that is economic power of the nation. And my concern is that the United States has retreated from the TPP that it was initially involved in forming, and both India and the United States have not bought in on the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the the new name for the TPP. So that leaves the space pretty much for China to dominate. And my concern is that that's really unhelpful. So while it's, I'm a former military officer, I understand defense issues mostly. I'm not an economist. I do, however, think the economic dimension is fundamentally important to this. Now, having said that, I do want to share my screen again, because there are some points I want to just visually show you. And here we are, back to this map. I mean, I love this map, okay? It gives you a real sense of where Australia sits and what effects it's figuring. Australia Foreign Policy White Paper of 2017 reflected the concern about the Trump administration and what I call that transactional retreat from ideational leadership. Now, that seems to be, with Joe Biden, it seems to be changing, but the basic premise of it still applies. It's about engagement in the Indo-Pacific, about engagement with the United States as much as we can, engagement with the Quad, as much of it as we can, but with modest expectations of its ability to do what NATO does. And at the same time, we emphasize ties with ASEAN, we emphasize ties with the Pacific, and on bolstering regional economic and trade ties. And we've signed a whole swag of free trade agreements in the last few years with our neighbours, and there's one in negotiation, I believe, with India, and it would be wonderful if we could get our act together, both of our countries, to match what we do with Japan and match what we do with the United States for the free trade to flow and for that economic stimulus to actually be a significant part to complement the cultural commonalities beyond cricket, English, and being Commonwealth members. It's really, I think, an important dimension to it. Of course, very interesting, there's quite a significant South Asian diaspora in Australia now, and they're all very interested in building Australia-India ties. And I think that's a very helpful thing. But let me just go on a little bit here. Thinking about, in last year, the Prime Minister announced a four-structure plan and a defence strategic update. And he talked about shaping, deterring and responding with credible military force when required. I talked about a defence capability plan that talked about the grey zone. And I think this is very important because we're not talking about World War II here. We're talking about a much more subtle, much more sophisticated, challenging a domain of not requiring and not facilitating and not allowing a kinetic military response. And that's what's throwing us all. But the question then is, are we doing enough? Is all of this enough? And I would put to you that it's not. And for Australia, as we think about, and if you remember my Venn diagram of great power contestation, looming environmental catastrophe, and a spectrum of governance challenges, when you look at the neighbourhood that Australia's in, there's a whole range of things that could go wrong. And we've handled all of these, the kinds of things that have happened in Australia and in its neighbourhood consecutively. But if they start happening concurrently, we're in a deep hole. We're in a real world of hurt. It's a real problem. So I've put up what I call a plan B, and there's a few aspects to this, dealing with that black triangular space in the middle. I think we need a political and societal reawakening for open-eyed engagement about the environmental challenges, contestational challenges, and governance challenges involving industry and technology, as you said before, General BK. We need to, I think, establish a National Institute of Net Assessment to think through the challenges holistically. Now, here's a thought. This is maybe something we can share amongst the Quad. But I would put to you that my previous point about reawakening needs to happen in all four of our countries as well. So the NINA, as I'm calling it, is about a holistic review of national requirements with an intergenerational mandate. Where are we going to be when our grandkids are in our shoes? Where are our nations going to be? And how do we position ourselves to get there? And I think there's an enormous amount of space for the Quad countries to be thinking collaboratively in this way, in this domain. Now, the ANU, where I am based, the Australian National University, has established an Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. That's a very positive step in the right direction, but I don't think it's far enough. We need to do considerably more than that. I think we need to strike a grand compact with the South Pacific, akin to what the United States has done with its treaty partners in the Pacific and New Zealand. And I've put up these countries, Tonga, Kiribati, Tuvalu and Nauru, as potential candidates because they're incredibly consequential and incredibly vulnerable because of the three overlapping areas of the Venn diagram. Then there's obviously deepening trade and security ties with Indonesia, with the rest of ASEAN, the United States, the Quad countries, Japan and India, and with all the NATO ones that are happy to join us. And here I see the list here, and I list them there for you. Some of the relationships that we're looking to bolster ties on. Now, beyond, we had the defence update, and I just touched on it a moment ago, the 2020 defence update. I think for us, we need to reimagine our engagement with Indonesia. In the past, a long time ago, 50, 60 years ago, we had confrontation with Indonesia. And we have seen Indonesia as a potential adversary and in our construct on defence security issues, in part because we couldn't think of any other conceivable threat. Well, now, of course, the world looks very different. We can conceive of an alternative threat, a great power that is quite threatening. So I think in that sense, we're now seeing Indonesia as a potential partner. And here, I think India and Australia in particular, with Japan, could collaborate on engaging constructively with Indonesia on its security challenges. Let's not forget, Indonesia has faced significant challenges from China over its exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea around Natuna Island. So I think we need to see the Quad as an important adjunct to managing our shared interests. And I've talked about Antarctica. I think we need to reimagine the way we play in that space and bolster our capability to operate around that and play a leading role there, because that is going to be increasingly important in the future. And I think for Australia, we need to bolster the Defence Force, our police and security and emergency services. And I propose that as an Australian universal scheme for national and community service. So it's incentivised volunteerism to work in a whole range of areas for domestic security, border force, cyber force, and for a range of paramedic and other bodies. So there's a range of things that Australia can do, but it's multifaceted. There's no one silver bullet for this challenge. It's really complicated, but as you see, the Quad is an integral part of that equation, and the future is real, and it is full of possibilities, and they're ones that are in our imagination. And I believe in blue sky mining, if you like, where we can make this happen. Yes, there are challenges, but there are incredible opportunities if we think about this as an opportunity and not just a crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor, for a very exhaustive way forward. And I'm very happy, probably after the question answer session, I'll like to propose some tie-up between you and USI, but we could discuss that a little later. Now, my request is to Mr. Bradford. You know, my belief is that US has to be an anchor in the Indo-Pacific, no matter which dispensation comes. You are the anchor and you are the glue. Therefore, the pertinent question that arises is, what has the Biden administration now in its hand to be put on the table? And there are certain concerns in other Quad countries, given the magnitude of your interdependence and complementarity, particularly in the economic sphere with China. Is there that you're really in for some big initiatives that we should be expecting from United States of America? Or are you going to be, in due course of time, if you reach a certain level of strategic accommodation, you are looking at a new modus vivendi with China? Over to you, Mr. Bradford. Hello. Is he there?
Yeah, thank you very much. So your first question is, what does the Biden administration have to put on the table? I would argue two things. I would argue a strong consensus that China is a competitor and that the United States needs to focus its foreign policy on winning that competition or setting the standards so that the world can win that competition. That consensus is quite strong. It emerged late in the Obama administration and it was empowered by the Trump administration. So all the things that we see that the Trump administration did on the competition side, I think that the Biden administration will continue. There's two big differences. The first is that the Biden administration will be a better run administration, and therefore it will have a better strategy. It will do much the same things, but it will put them together in packages that make sense. There was a bit in the Trump administration of let's try lots of things and see what happens, or let's see what makes it through the nonsense, because there was no coherent policy making process. The return of process will enable the return of strategy as opposed to action. So I think that's a huge difference. I also think that it would be a level-handed approach to allies. And I think I mentioned this earlier. The Trump administration never abandoned allies, but it sometimes made things unnecessarily hard for them. It sometimes picked fights that didn't need to be fought. And it sometimes opened scabs that existed. And so I think that the Biden administration is going to be able to, that's the second thing that they can put on the table, is the leadership that we've come to, historically accustom ourselves to coming from the United States. And I'd also like to point out, just this other kind of idea. There's a talk of a United States retreat or a U.S. loss of interest in the United States, and to some extent that's true. A loss of interest in the region. To some extent, that's true. You don't see as many you did not see in the Trump administration as many senior leaders at ASEAN meetings than you saw under the Obama administration. You saw continue, but I think that the good point is that it was always the anchor and it was always the glue. You can let's take a case study in Thailand. One could take a case study that Dr. Blackson knows very well, Thailand, and it's leaning a bit more towards China. Very much true. But the United States is still the security partner that has more than 50 exercises with Thailand every year. It still has Cobra Gold. Even in years where the United States and Thailand had great friction and scaled back Cobra Gold, it was still by far and away the largest security event in the calendar in Thailand. The same thing is true of India in many ways. India is one of the US partners, which is in some ways furthest away militarily, yet India has more exercises with US PACOM than any other foreign partner. And in fact, India is the #1 exercise partner of US PACOM if counted by number of events. The bases in Japan still housed a Navy, which is bigger than the Australian Navy. The US Navy in Japan is bigger than the Australian Navy. It's bigger than the Royal Navy. It's about the same size as the French Navy. So the United States in many ways never left. And I think the Biden administration is just going to be able to use everything more smartly, backed up by the consensus that we've seen develop in the last 5 to 6 years. I'd actually really like to talk about some of the other things that were brought up, but that's the only question you asked me, and I'm conscious of time. So I'll hand it back over to the chair.
Thank you very much for that very, very interesting and very, very assuring response from you. And I think we have had enough and very, very stimulating discussion. I think now we should give some time to our participants. And now I'll request NIICE to please handle the question answer session. And what I propose is that we have a group of questions, maybe 3 to 4 questions, and then we'll request our panelists to respond.
Sure, sir.
Over to NIICE. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I think we'll club together. General Sinha Admiral Sinha has left, I think, right, sir?
Yeah.
So we'll pose one question to each speaker. First, I would like to thank all the speakers for their wonderful remarks. Let me open the floor for discussion. The first question is for Professor Sato. Like almost all the countries who are part of Quad are economically dependent on China. So what role will economy play in the future of Indo-Pacific strategy? That is for Professor Sato. We have received another question for Professor John Blaxland. His question is, will Indo-Pacific strategy bring China and Russia together? Is there chances of military alliance between China and Russia in future? And third question is for John Bradford. The quadrilateral grouping is evidently China-centric, triggered by its swift militarization and territorial claims in the South China Sea, along with the strategic naval outpost in the Indian Ocean region. In my view, the Quad's strategic promise is oxymoronic because we are hoping for alignment with while retaining autonomy. So what is your view, whether the desire for alignment and autonomy are possible? So maybe you can follow the same order.
Yeah, please, you conduct the discussion now. Okay,
Sure.
I'll speak towards the end.
Okay, so I guess I was named first to go. So the role of economy in Indo-Pacific strategy. I think there are a couple of things we should remember as quite credible assumption. I think the Indo-Pacific region for the next 20 years, 30 years, 40 years will be the leading region on the planet. I think it's a growth center of the world. And that means whether you're talking about the Europeans or the North Americans, they will be looking at the Indo-Pacific region with a desire to be part of it, desire to be trading with, desire to be investing in. It's a place of opportunity. And the integration, I think, has been achieved through, but the Europeans, they are signing free trade agreement with this region as well. And the United States, without TPP, is going to be left out. And I think it's something the Biden administration needs to seriously think about how to return to this region. And now, luckily UK left the EU, but now it's expressing interest in joining TPP. And with Japan, Australia, UK working together, then even China joining TPP has become somewhat more realistic with the participation of UK, because if China comes by itself, China will try to dominate, and they will sabotage TPP from inside out. But the more true free traders within the group, the more likely that the TPP can discipline China, not the other way around. So that's a very important part that the Europeans are getting involved, and we need America back into TPP. And finally, I think with a strong economic integration, including China, I think there's a good chance that this peace based on liberal interdependence will suppress the military rivalry and so forth. We need to work on economic integration of this region, not the division, the kind of division the Trump-Pompeo line was talking about. So that would be my answer.
Thank you, sir. Shall we move to Professor John Blaxland?
Thank you. So will the Indo-Pacific strategy bring China and Russia together? Well, they're already pretty darn close. They're collaborating more than ever, and this is, it's quite a conundrum, because when you think back to the days when Henry Kissinger went to Beijing and in the Cold War and supposedly split off China from its alliance with Russia, it was about changing the power dynamics on the Eurasian landmass. That seems to have been reversed lately. And the challenge is actually working out how to mitigate the consequences of that. And it's hard to do. Essentially, China and the Russians, I was going to say the Soviet Union, which is a bit of a flashback, but the China and the Russians at the moment have a strong and compelling interest to cooperate. China has what Russia wants, and Russia has what China wants. Russia has nukes, it's got advanced military technology, and it has derives considerable financial economic benefit from sales to China. China, of course, has the opportunity to purchase a lot of oil and gas from Russia, and but of course, being neighbours, we know that they've fought in the past. We know that this is not a particularly intimate relationship, and we know that while Putin and Xi are managing to get on okay, it's not out of a deep set fondness for each other or a deep sense of common culture, common identity. Their identities are quite distinct and quite separate. So my sense is that what we're seeing is a temporary situation. Now, it may well be enduring for some time, but I don't think we need to worry about this being some kind of deep set, more integral network or a NATO-like replacement, because essentially Russia has a lot to lose if China comes out more powerful than it already is. The vast expanses of Eastern Russia, sparsely populated but resource-rich Eastern Russia, is in terms of intergenerational concerns, a real worry for the powers that be in Moscow, and so that's a fact. That's not going away. And so while it's convenient for now, I don't think we need to worry too much about it in the long run. But in the short term, there is certainly a lot of cooperation between the two. My concern in this space in particular is the prospect of, the classic Eurasian landmass challenge, where one great power exploits a crisis and generates an opportunity at one end of the Eurasian landmass, be it on the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Straits, East China Sea, Senkaku Island, you know what the Chinese call Diaoyu, or the South China Sea, or at the same time, at the other end of the Eurasian landmass, you have a Kaliningrad crisis, something affecting the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, some kind of challenge to NATO in that space that could present a real conundrum for the United States, for NATO, for the West, and certainly for the Quad. That's, of course, that's actually in the short to medium term, that is a not implausible prospect that we need to be mindful of and thinking through. Thank you.
Mr. Bradford.
Yeah, thank you. The question I received had to do with strategic alignment within the Quad. And I think this is an essential point, because while the four members share broad consensus, what we have is not real strategic alignment. There's a lot of divergence in the details and some amount of residual mistrust. I would point out, I'm going to talk a little bit about the details of where those relationships lie, but I would point out that building alignment, we can encourage that through diplomacy and education, track 1 and track 2 dialogues, But at the end of the day, strategic alignment is about interests. And nations have to reach their own consensus or their own awakening, perhaps, to know exactly where their interests were. And as long as there remains divergence of interests, then the Quad is not going to be an ironclad relationship like the United States enjoys with Australia or Japan. So speaking about those relationships, I think of the members of the Quad, the US-Japan leg of the Quad is probably the strongest. I admit, as an American naval officer who spent more than 15 years in Japan, I carry with me a bias to that assessment. But I think it's really true. I think the outlook is the same. I think there's a lot of experience operating together. The biggest differences would be in language and style. The United States still, has a cowboy diplomacy type style, whereas Japan is usually labeled as a courteous power, a stealth superpower, even a ninja superpower. Ninja term not being an assassin, but someone who uses their foreign policy as something that is thought out and planned and quiet and balanced. And then of course, that's not to belittle the US-Australia relationship, which has lasted a number of wars where we fought side by side and many other hurdles. Partially encouraged by those two strong points, the Japan-Australia alliance or cooperation has come a long way. The only country that Japan will defend through its policies of cooperative self-defense is Australia. The only country that Japan has a reciprocal access agreement with other than the United States is Australia. In fact, some would argue that's actually a stronger statement because the US-Japan SOFA allows the US to come to Japan, but not Japan to come to the US, while as Japan-Australia agreement is in fact reciprocal. But the India-Australia link is much weaker. I am not the expert on that in this room, but I think it's quite clear that trust is not as high, confidence is not as high, and experience in the relationship is not as high. So what does that mean the Quad can become? I would say the Quad can become a framework. I would agree with all the speakers who've said that it shouldn't be a NATO. It can't be a NATO. A NATO is a collective self-defense organization. It's an organization that has common C2. The Quad is an organization that thus far's biggest achievement is a multilateral naval exercise once. And I think that's a great thing, and I think there's great potential. But to carry from there to NATO is a very long road to go ahead. And I guess I just add to that, the questions that kind of came up in the chat about bringing in extra powers, additional powers. Additional powers is great in that it broadens the network and expands the alliance and brings more power to it. But no matter who that partner would be, it's only going to further dilute the alignment between the members. I think that the best candidate would be France. France is a large country that has that sits like the United States, Australia, Japan, and India at the edges of the Indo-Pacific, and it has a fairly common view. But there's even more divergence between France and the current Quad members than there are between the current Quad members. I think talk of bringing in Singapore, Indonesia, as a person who lives in Southeast Asia right now, and Southeast Asia security is my bread and butter, they lack this strategic view of China as a threat that needs to be balanced against in any sort of hardware military way, even in terms of economic interdependence and divergence there. So while it would be, in an ideal world, wonderful, the divergence is too great that all you're going to do is water down the Quad to become another talk shop. So I think that answers the original question and a little bit more so. So let me hand the chair back to Pramod. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We are running out of time. We hardly have 15 minutes, but we have received around 35 questions on Facebook, Twitter, and different platforms. So let me put the last set of questions, one for each speaker. But if you want to mention any important aspect that is there on the chat, maybe you can use the 3 minutes for each speaker that we have. For for John Bradford, is there any scope of militarization of Indo-Pacific through Quad? What would be the place for a small Pacific states like Solomon Islands or Kiribati or others in future of Indo-Pacific strategy in light of rivalry between US and China? That is one. For Professor Blaxland, can we expect an Asian NATO framework, although the idea was expressed by the Trump administration? As of NATO countries, two of them, UK and Canada, shares a head of the state with Australia. How important is the shared Commonwealth link for dominations? Does Brexit makes the Commonwealth tie more important? Where does India fit into the shared cultural, linguistic, and supporting links with Australia? The third question is for Professor Sato. At previous Quad meeting, Japan has been careful in not naming China. In fact, it was only been the US that has openly mentioned China and has been critical of it. The other Quad members has always calibrated their response on China's sensitivity about the Quad. However, at the recent Quad foreign minister meeting held on 18 February, it was only Japan which has made a direct mention of China in its statement. Does this indicate a shift in Japan's approach? Is it hardening its position on China as Australia and India too have done in the recent past? So again, maybe we can start with John.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I've made my point pretty clear that I don't think that the Quad is or should become anytime soon some sort of hard military alliance. However, I do think there are things that on the military side it should be doing right away. I think that these might be some of the low-hanging fruits that were discussed earlier, and I think they can be very important to enabling military cooperation down the road. So I'm going to use a historic example to illustrate what I'm talking about how the Quad can form a framework for others to follow, and then I'll give you two specific areas where we could focus. So there is a code book called the Allied Tactical Publication number 1. This is a NATO code book, and it grew directly out of a US-UK an Allied code book used during World War II. It is the code which surface ships use to communicate with each other swiftly and clearly about their maneuvering intentions, and for formation steaming and also for anti-submarine warfare. This is a NATO code. It is NATO confidential. However, if I walk onto, as again, I was a Navy officer for many years, if I walk onto the bridge of any ship in the JMSDF or any ship in the Royal Australian Navy, I will see this exact same code book. Now, that's at a classified level. These are all good partners of the United States and of NATO. But when Australia in 1999 first introduced the idea of queues to the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, they said queues needs a simple code that every ship can talk to another, every Navy ship can talk to another. And if you look at the queues book that Australia produced in 1999, it is essentially ATP code book number 1 with the sensitive sections removed from it. So therefore, if you're a NATO sailor and you understand ATP number 1 and you memorize some of these codes, you will immediately be able to speak the language of queues. Now queues is used throughout the Pacific. And when I did my first Malabar exercise between the United States and India and Japan in the early 2000s, the Indian Navy officers I spoke to were not overly familiar with this code. Now they are. So are the Chinese. So are the Filipinos. So it's not a secure code for military operations anymore, but it is a secure communications device. It is a useful communications device. So in this way, a NATO standard became the Indo-Pacific standard. I believe now Indo-Pacific standards should be set by the Indo-Pacific countries, and who better to do it than the Quad nations, the 4 democratic corners and most powerful states that are aligned towards the free flow of information and commerce. So the 3 areas actually I will talk about where I think they could cooperate the most are 1, access. I already mentioned that Japan and Australia have a reciprocal access agreement. The United States enjoys similar opportunities to station its forces and move its forces freely through Australia and Japan. I think that India could hasten its development of access agreements with all 3 partners. Again, using my own personal experience, when I visit India as a military officer, it is one of the most difficult countries to gain the access and work through the bureaucracy for. This is because India's bureaucracy is famous, but it's also because we're just not as familiar as we are with other bureaucratic heavily states. So even when the defense ministers or the Navy chiefs have said, make it happen, it becomes hard to happen because we don't know the right phone number of the harbor master or what forms he might be responsible for that the Navy doesn't handle. So if those reciprocal access agreements could be created, then they could then be replicated. They would then become the standard we could use for the South Pacific or any other part of the world. Similarly with logistics, so most of the members of the Quad have some sort of AXA. These could be developed, these could be flexed, and these could be standardized. And then while I don't advocate bringing other states like Singapore, Indonesia into the Quad formally, it provides a template for easy communication to develop new standards with countries like Indonesia or France or the UK, other places that I mentioned. And then finally, the area is joint capacity building. The United States and Japan are the furthest along in this path, but we're still finding it very difficult. The concept that capacity building should be aligned and coordinated is an easy concept, but when you get into the nuts and bolts of it, it gets pretty complex. And it only really works when the people on the ground in the host nations are doing the hard lifting of coordinating activities. And in terms of maritime security, we can focus on all 4 countries sort of best partners, including Vietnam and the Philippines, where the most has happened already, but it should be expanded, included other ASEAN states in the South Pacific. And kind of going beyond just maritime security capacity building, going back to one of the initial conversations about infrastructure. If we are concerned about the geoeconomic influence which is being created by the BRI, then we need to create an alternate to that. And the way that alternate is going to come along is either trust the United States, the world's second biggest economy, to do it on their own, or team up. And again, that's harder, it's easier said than done. The only example I know of cooperative infrastructure development within the Quad that involves more than just 2 of the states of the Quad is the US, Japan, Australia cooperation to develop undersea cables to feed the internet connectivity of Palau. If we can do it there, why can't we do it elsewhere? So this is going to take a robust discussion, but I think especially on the tech side, given India's strength in that sector, there's a great there's a great opportunity. We just need to unlock it and figure out what it is and how it's going to happen.
Thank you. May I now request Professor Blackson?
Okay. Can you hear me? Everyone fine?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
So the question I was asked was, can we expect an ASEAN NATO framework? I think it's useful to remember we used to have the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization in the 50s, 60s, and into the early 70s, and it was a bit dysfunctional because of the competing interests. My sense is that there are the dynamics that made that Sato not work effectively are probably still largely at play. But I think there are some important sub-regional mechanisms that can be capitalized upon. In Australia, we have the 5-power defence arrangement with Malaysia, Singapore, the UK, and New Zealand. I think similar, there are some other sub-regional groups, such as a sub-regional counter-terrorism network involving Australia, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, and Philippines. And I think there's an opportunity with the Quad to look at inviting informally, at least, some of the other countries that we want to engage in the space between our 4 nations, in that Indo-Pacific space that I put up on the map, to join. I'm thinking Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. And I think I would actually want to challenge what John said before about Indonesia. Yes, there are some dynamics at work there, but Indonesia is more mindful of Chinese pressure than ever, and has more cause to be looking to collaborate with other parties than ever over particularly how China's been asserting pressure in the South China Sea and elsewhere. But that doesn't mean it's an easy fix. It certainly isn't. And that's a debate I think we probably need a whole nother session on to explore. One of the other question I was asked was how important is shared Commonwealth links? Look, the fact that we speak English is very, very helpful. Culturally, the links with Canada, the United Kingdom and New Zealand are very useful and important. Of course, the United States, the former part of the British Empire, it speaks English as well. That makes it a very significant connection. Does Brexit make it Britain more significant? Look, on one level, it probably does, because the Brits are more interested in operating in our space than ever before. They're interested in trade ties in our neighbourhood. They're interested in security ties as well. They're interested in selling things, British technology. So that's something to bear in mind. How does shared cultural ties affect India-Australia relations? Look, I think there's a significant increase in ties over culture, shared interests, free trade agreement prospects coming up, and so on, that really do augur well for the ties between our two countries. So I'd end it on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. May I now request Professor Sato?
Thank you very much. Actually, I did answer the question that was asked in the previous round. So I'll just add on to some of the points raised to John as well. And I think the one issue we need to pay close attention to is the smaller island states, both in the Pacific and also in the Indian Ocean region. I think many of those islands feel really neglected. We are talking about the Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean connectivities, but most islands just don't exist in the conversation unless they start borrowing big money from China and developing port facility, which we suspiciously look at the potential, the Chinese naval use. So that is a serious problem we have, and I think we need to pay a close attention to those islands on a more regular basis. And I think some of the islands mentioned, like Kiribati, is a very important issue because one of the islands is pretty close to Hawaii, and the political competition inside Kiribati is really divided between the pro-West camp and pro-China camp. And something like that is, we should prevent, the pro-China faction to, dominate and reverse their policy 180 degrees. I mean, we do have success in the North Pacific, and Federated States of Micronesia is now, moving into this the compact state agreement with the U.S. and so forth, and the Palau, the pro-China elements lost power and so forth. But this kind of tit for tat between the U.S. and Japan on one hand, and Australia together, and China on the other, has been constant feature in the Pacific. And I think it's moving into the Indian Ocean region, involving India increasingly. So this is a very difficult time, but it will give those small states a kind of leverage. But although it's a leverage, it's a small state. It doesn't require a huge sum of money, and we have to be in that game. And John mentioned the ninja diplomacy of Japan. I like that. I think US-Japan coordination is being tested right now in how we deal with Myanmar situation. And in the recent Quad meeting, Myanmar was mentioned, and the US already has sanctions on those the military generals' personal assets in the United States. Japan has been pretty quiet on the question of sanction, and because Japan lifted all those sanctions after Myanmar democratized, and infrastructure aid is still flowing into Myanmar. But US put pressure on Myanmar, EU put pressure on Myanmar, and the demonstration already has resulted in at least 4 deaths as of yesterday. I don't know how many today, but Japan will come under more pressure. But the one lesson we learned was that, if Japan stops aiding Myanmar, Myanmar will simply walk into China's embrace. And we've almost seen that before. Although Japan did not completely cut off Myanmar, it continued ninja diplomacy as John described. And maybe again, this is the time for ninja diplomacy.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mr. John Bradford, Professor John Blaxland, and Professor Yoichiro Sato, Admiral Sinha. I would like to request Chair Major General Sharma to make his concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pramod, for facilitating this discussion today and reaching out to some of the finest minds on Indo-Pacific and geopolitics. We had very fruitful discussion and some very pragmatic and practical suggestions have come out. I'm so happy that none of the speakers resorted to jingoism and some kind of a wild sight line. I'm sure that, we would take note of all the recommendations and suggestions that have been made, and hopefully these get factored into the policy framework at some level. I just want to say that there are 3 countries who are facing China's belligerence on day-to-day basis. It is Japan, Taiwan, and India. And we have wealth of experience how to deal with this country and how to watch their strategic behavior. There is nobody who can contain any other country in today's world, particularly a country of the size of China. But I feel that this should not intoxicate China. Some of their recent behavior has been very, very unilateral and bullying, and particularly when it comes to smaller countries in the South China Sea. So therefore, there is a need to kind of arrest or moderate that kind of a unilateral and bullying behavior. And that is the purpose that one has to look at from certain alternatives. I mean, it's very easy for United States of America actually to catch the Chinese bull by the horns. Look at the power asymmetry that is there between United States of America and China. But, well, that is not the way the modern and civilized states behave. Therefore, I think it's a very good step that President Joe Biden is looking at reviving the multilateralism, is taking on the international responsibility, and likewise all other countries who are stakeholders in an open and peaceful and inclusive Indo-Pacific, they will all put their shoulders to the wheel and see that we have a geopolitical construct that balances China, makes it as a responsible stakeholder, and we usher a new era of peace and stability in the region. So with these few words, I will now say goodbye to all our panelists for giving their valuable time, and I would be reaching out to you, and we could have some kind of a tie-up between NIICE-USI and your respective think tanks and look at some of these very critical issues in detailed manner. With that, I thank you once again, and wish you and your families all the best, and also thank the participants for their valuable time and participation. Thank you, good luck, and have a good day.